Welcome to the video. I'm going to be walking you through a new product update. And this one is for my Cubase Pro project that works with EastWest's Hollywood Orchestra Diamond Edition. If you purchase the previous Diamond template or the complete bundle from the web store, this will be a free update for you. In fact, it'll be an additional download that you'll find at the top of the list if you log back in. First of all, I'll cover the minor changes and the cosmetic stuff, and then we'll move on more to the juicy updates. When you open up the project for the first time, you'll find that it's been completely reorganized. The sections are in score order, starting with woodwinds, brass, percussion, strings, and choirs. At the bottom of the project, you'll find the group tracks folder, and inside here, you'll find the instrument buses folder that gives you access to all of the summed instruments and reverb sends. You'll find the main section folder, which is the master groups, and these have been reworked in the project to give you more control. And then finally, at the very bottom, you'll find a new folder containing audio tracks, and these allow you to print the dry and wet signals separately inside the project. I'll cover these all a little bit more later when we talk about the routing. Now, in terms of organization, at the very top of each section folder, you will find the key switch folder. Inside here, you'll find the pre-disabled key switch tracks ready to go. All you need to do is select what you want to use, right-click, then go to Enable Selected Tracks. Now, when the tracks are activated, the Opus instance will be turned on, and when you open up the instrument editor, you'll see that the patch has been preloaded and purged. As soon as you start playing keys on your keyboard, it'll start loading the samples into RAM. For the key switch tracks, using the expression maps of Cubase Pro is pretty straightforward. Open up the MIDI event that you've just recorded, and then make sure the Articulations and Dynamics lane is showing at the bottom by clicking the plus symbol and selecting it. Then you can draw in the key switch changes in the window down here, and when you play back, it'll trigger the articulation changes. If you find that some of these are not triggering the samples, just make sure to open up the instrument editor for the track and check that the articulations are switched on, as some of them may be switched off by default. When it comes to the other instrument folders here in the project, these all contain the split articulations. For example, if I open up the English horn, you'll see that you have your legatos, longs, shorts, and then where possible, effects. One of the most requested features for this update was to add negative track delay values to all of these split articulations throughout the project, and I've done just that. The values that have been applied are a starting point and will get you in the ballpark for having all of your MIDI snap to the grid and the instrument patches sounding more like they're in time with the click. However, you do need to note that with things like legatos, you may need to increase the value or add a higher negative value, and you may also still need to offset the MIDI for some notes occasionally, depending on the edits in the crossfades for those instruments. One of the other changes to the project is the use of MIDI modifiers inside of Cubase to remap some of the untuned percussion. This has been done to make it easier for you to audition the untuned percussion just by pressing on C1. So now you might find for things like sustain cymbals, you don't have to hunt around for where they live on the octaves. And you can just simply audition them straight away by clicking on C1. This also makes life easier for when you want to move MIDI across the untuned parts, because they'll all share the same mapping. Now, the other use of MIDI modifiers is also to adjust some of the velocity curves for certain instruments. You may find this not just on percussion, but on some of the short notes for the individual instrument patches as well. One of the other requests for this update was to remove most of the unnecessary tracks that people just don't tend to use that much. For example, the Divisi strings have been completely removed because they were just mono microphone positions. The duplicate versions of patches, such as the high and low memory versions, have also had a bit of a change. For any instruments that had a light version or a low memory version, these have been removed from the project. However, there were some instruments that don't have a high memory equivalent or max version. So the light versions have been left in for those. The other tracks that have been removed in the project relate to the Orchestrator. In the old template, I literally had a track for every single preset, preloaded and ready to go, but this added quite a lot onto the track count and to the file size of the project. So now, at the very top, there's a sketch folder that contains a Steinway D piano from the EastWest pianos library, and now there is 4 Orchestrator tracks in the folder. You can just use these to sketch out ideas. There's no presets preloaded as such, you can choose those yourself, score out some ideas, and then you can transfer MIDI across if you wish onto the other instruments. So I'm going to give you an example of how you can use the Orchestrator to quickly sketch out an idea and how you can split that MIDI down onto the different instrument tracks in the project. So I've loaded up the Elves World 1 patch, and by default it will have the reverb on. I mean, we can turn this off if we want to, it's not really going to make too much of a difference. And then all you do is if you hit play and start, recording your MIDI performance, it will then be in memory here. And then we can drag that into the project and then start copying things over to the different instruments. So let's go ahead and play something in. If we stop playing, you'll see that this icon then changes. Now, with this, when you drag the MIDI into the project, do it somewhere out the way towards the bottom. You might find it also creates an instance of Hallian Sonic in the instrument rack, which you'll need to remove afterwards, but don't worry too much about it. Now that the MIDI has been copied in, we can see that it's got the track names on here. So the 2 violins, legato, cello, legato, basses, sustain. And all we have to do is just copy these onto the split tracks. A way to do this is just set the play cursor at the start of the event, and then you can use Control and X or Control and C to copy. So free flutes legato, I'm going to do Control and X. And then in the search field here, I'll type free FL for free flutes, and then choose one of the legatos, and it will open up that track in the project. I can enable this straight away, and then just paste this over. And that's how you kind of do it. It's a bit tedious, but it gets the job done. Once you've transferred the MIDI over, you can then hide all the disabled tracks if you like by going to this button and then hide disabled tracks, or you can just show only the tracks with data on. Obviously, if you want to tidy up the MIDI and snap it to the grid as well, that might help. And when you hit play, when it comes to all the different instruments and sections, one of the things I wanted to do for this project was try and enhance the out-of-the-box sound a little. So I've made use of different microphone positions, which vary throughout. Generally speaking, woodwinds will more or less use the close in mid mics, depending on the instrument. Some of them may still just use the main mic. For the brass instruments, you may find I'm using a mix of the mid, main and surround, or you might find there's a close mic and surround mic that's being used. For the strings, it's a similar story. You might find I'm using just the main mics, or I might have added a bit of close mic or mid mic in, depending. When it comes to percussion, you may find I've used a few different microphones depending on the instrument. And it might be just the main mics, or you might find I'm using close and main mics, or you even might find I'm using the vintage mics. And for the vintage mics, I prefer the sound of these on a lot of the different instruments. And also, they seem to have a less noise in as well. With some of the percussion samples, there was a little bit of hiss in the mic recordings, and it kind of stuck out quite a bit. So I've made conscious decisions to try and make the samples overall sound a bit cleaner, as we are sending these to reverbs, which also leads into the fact that some of the tails on these instruments have also been adjusted as well to try and tighten them up and reduce any release noises. You'll also find that the reverbs are turned off by default. I want to go over how the project is routed. So for this, I've loaded up the additional template that's available in the download, and this will just have the MIDI on that I've quickly chucked in for this demonstration. At the bottom, if we go down to the new group tracks folder with the print stems, you can now directly record the wet and dry signals into the project. All you have to do is select all these tracks, make sure the arm for record is on, and then hit record after you've finished scoring and mixing everything. Obviously, when you're scoring something, you can take a lot more time to try and make it sound pretty using the different articulations. This is just a quick sketch. Now, here we have our dry stems, and if I want to just preview these, obviously we can just solo them if we want to listen to the woodwinds. And then if we want to listen to the summed reverbs, we can listen to the woodwinds reverb. Now, because of this, the setup for the master groups has changed. So one of the requests was to add additional high and low versions instead of just having one bus for, say, the woodwinds, one for brass, one for strings, etc., etc. So now we have the high winds and low winds bus, high brass, high perk, mid perk, low perk, string ensemble, strings high, strings low, choirs, and keys, respectively. When it comes to the individual instruments and how they're routed, this is pretty much the same as what it was in the previous versions of the template. The only difference now is that we have these reverb sends and this reverb bus that sums these sends that is then sent to the input of one of the audio tracks. But if I flip over to the mixer, it'll make more sense. When you open up the project mixer for the first time, it will be in the default view that shows you all of the summed instrument buses. And this is just a convenient way to tidy up all of the individual audio channels that are created every time you enable a track in the project. If you want to look at the original audio channels, just go to the configurations at the top and go to enabled tracks, and this will flip the view over to those audio channel outputs for each sampler. And you'll notice that I've actually trimmed the pre-gain on all of these individual articulation tracks to try and balance things out a little bit for you before they go to the bus. If you do want to increase the level of the staccatos or something to suit your preferences, you can do so from here. You can just tweak the faders, or you can do it on the track in the project. But then when it comes to mixing the overall instruments and how they are together, you go back to the main window and you just play around with the faders until you're happy with the sound. In the other template, all the faders are set at unity, so that's 0 dB across the board, and the sends will also be at -10 by default, which leads us on to the reverb. For the instrument buses, these are sent to one of their corresponding reverbs in the section, and each section will have a number of different reverb buses set up ready to go. Here you'll see that I'm using on the inserts EastWest Spaces 2, which is something that comes with the Composer Cloud. If you don't have EastWest Spaces 2, don't worry, you can just replace these with whatever reverb you like, and make sure you set the signal to 100% wet. But for those of you that have got Spaces installed, or Spaces 2 should I say, you'll find that I've picked a bunch of different presets and I've kind of tweaked them a little bit to shorten the envelopes on the tails, and also change things like the filters to roll off some low end, high end, and play around with the width a little bit. Now, with the reverbs for the sections here, if there's more than one, these are summed to a bus, as I said previously, to go to the input of an audio track. If you want to just view all of the reverb sends and these buses, just go to the configurations and go to reverb, and you'll see them here. Something really important to note with the routing though with the reverb is that the outputs are not going directly to the main groups here, they're separate. So if you adjust the volume of the main group, the reverb levels will still remain exactly the same. So that's something to take into consideration. However, if you don't want to use the reverb channels and how I've set it up, you can always turn all these off or remove them from the project and apply a reverb to the buses. if you want to work that way. Now you'll also notice in the project mixer here we have icons. These have been mostly taken from the Orchestral Complete icon pack, and it's just a way for you to easily spot what instruments you're going to be working on. There are some new icons that I've made specifically for this template, mainly the strings here and also the main group, so you can see that these are your main master stems. Now when it comes to the mix, you will see obviously there's some plugins here that I've added in. However, these are not doing a great deal, if I'm honest. They're just doing some very subtle tweaks because I didn't want to change the sound too much, because I feel mixing is a very personal thing and it also depends on the piece of music that you've created. Obviously, there are certain things you can do for certain libraries to try and correct things, but again, I didn't really want to do an awful lot and change the sound too much. For the instances of frequency, you might find I'm doing some very tiny boosts, or I might be using the dynamic EQ on it to do some cuts for certain resonant things that pop up. I might be adding a little bit more low end for certain things. You'll also see that I'm using instances of Imager, which is another stock plugin that allows you to control the stereo width of frequency bands. And this is mainly used on the lower frequency instruments to try and reduce the width of the low end to make it more focused and less washy. You'll also find that on percussion, there's not a real great deal going on here. I'm just using an instance of Squasher on the timpani, which is to give it a bit of beefiness, and then the envelope shaper just to shape the attack, and an instance of frequency again. Another plugin you'll probably spot in here is a free plugin from Plugin Alliance called BX Subfilter, which is to help enhance the low end on certain things. This, if you want to get this, go to my webpage and on the product description, scroll down and you'll see a little button you can click called, I think I put it as Get Here, next to an image of this, and it'll take you directly to the page where you can download it. And then scrolling across even more, again, just a few more instances of frequency doing things. And on the main groups to the right here, for this particular project with the MIDI in, I've added some additional plugins. So there's some instances of magneto on the brass just to give it a bit of bite. And then you'll see that I'm using the multi-band compressor as well for certain groups, just to give them a bit of life. For the default project where everything's set to Unity, these extra plugins have not been added. And you also might find that things like the Pultec EQ and BX Subfilter are on the post inserts and not the pre-inserts. When it comes to the mastering chain, for this MIDI project that will be included in the download, that's slightly different to the default one. So I chucked on Imager just to do a dynamic high shelf boost, and then mid and low. There's an instance of Imager again just to reduce free bands in terms of their width in the stereo field slightly. And then there's the maximizer on there, just to give you some volume back. Again, I wouldn't necessarily save these as a preset chain that you can use on other projects. It's just something I slapped on there just to give it a bit of an extra sound out of the box as a starting point for you. Now, I think I've covered everything in this video in terms of what the template has to offer. If I've missed anything, I'll be sure to do subsequent videos for you. I hope you guys enjoy this free update, and I'd love to hear some of the music that you create with it. Send it over to me, go over to the website and use the contact form to get in touch. I'll take a listen to it and maybe even add it to the product page as some demos, as one thing that's severely lacking on my website is demos. So anyone there that wants to help out, much appreciated. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.